If you remember, it was El Jefe, back-to-back belly-to-belly, with Andrew Evil Eyes Cuomo, King Cuomo II, who talked about how in rebuilding those damaged parts of the shore along New York, whether it was Seagate or Coney Island in Brooklyn, whether it was Breezy Point, the Rockaways, Far Rockaway, out in Queens, or Long Beach on the south shore of Long Island, that if you followed their specs, insurance, flood insurance, would actually cost less. In fact, let's go to the audio tape. It was El Jefe Chris Christie at his favorite spot on all of the Jersey Shore, Seaside Heights.
Building to these new standards is going to save an extraordinary amount of money in the long run regarding insurance. Costs of not building to the safer standards are serious.
And in fact, he went on to suggest that you might actually be paying less for your flood insurance than even before Hurricane Sandy hit.
Build to the higher standards, lower flood insurance costs. Don't build to the higher standards, significantly more expensive flood insurance costs in the future.
I don't want to parse language there, but I felt the governor in Jersey, as the governor in New York, had been very disingenuous with people who are making that decision as we speak, whether to rebuild or go somewhere else, particularly when it comes to the issue of flood insurance. So I figure, rather than me just be typically critical of them, which some people accuse me of being, hey, I'll go to an expert, see what the real deal is. Scott Major, a natural disaster specialist, a nationally renowned attorney, who has counseled 5,000 residents over the last 5 weeks, people who have been affected by Hurricane Sandy, who will have to make that same decision, whether to rebuild, reoccupy, or not to rebuild and reoccupy. That is the question. Good morning, Scott.
Hey, thanks for having me, pal.
All right, Scott, first off, this whole issue of flood insurance. I want to take you back to a few days after Hurricane Sandy. I'm standing in Old Howard Beach. I've just had a conversation with my cousin, Joey G., the Cheech from Howard Beach, who did have the flood insurance through FEMA. My nephew and niece who had homes in Old Howard Beach did not, so they got totally bum rushed out. But when I actually talked to the FEMA adjuster who had been sent, who was in from Arkansas, he kept chastising me for suggesting that there was some kind of quasi-partnership between the private sector and FEMA when it comes to flood insurance. Could you please clarify for me how flood insurance is issued, who participates in that, and who funds it?
Flood insurance can be in two forms. The first form can be when you can't get insurance and you fit inside of a National Flood Insurance Program or an NFIP. The second component is when you're not considered in that zone of risk or where there actually are other insurance companies. Now, when you talk about the flood insurance you're speaking about, it's generally where you cannot get flood insurance elsewhere. It's in some zone that it's determined that it's a high incidence of flood, and what happens is that the government funds those programs. They will pay up to a certain amount based on a standardized flood insurance policy, which is much more restrictive than a typical flood insurance policy you might buy from an insurance company. So what happens then is that when you fall within that, if you have a damage and it's covered like a flood, like these Hurricane Sandy claims, then FEMA will come in and evaluate your claim. Now, the reality is that the United States government is not an insurance company, so they will subcontract that out to regular insurance companies to go out and assess your risk, and that is why some people who have national flood insurance have people calling them from Kansas and Texas saying, hi, I'm with Travelers or some other insurance company. I want to come out and visit your property. So it's a federally based system. The concept of these new flood zone, elevation stuff, also actually called the advisory-based flood elevation, is the concept that they want to raise property to a higher level so that it has a less probability of being flooded, and therefore there would be a higher chance of getting insurance at a lower rate. What happened was that FEMA originally, does these things after storms. They actually assess the flood risk in a particular community, and then they put out information. Now, a governor doesn't have to endorse them, but when they do, what happens is it sets up a situation where if you don't elevate your house to 4 or 8 or 12 feet above level, depending on where you are, you're going to pay $30,000 or $40,000 a year in insurance. And so that's the problem that's associated with adopting these. The concept is great. Hey, we're going to raise everybody's property up and, have a moat effect of, water's not going to get to us. But it can be very costly to do that, and you have to do it in order to lower your insurance rates.
Okay, so let's assume that I have the wherewithal to take my beachfront property and put it on stilts, let's say concrete pontoons of one type or another, the best that the market can supply, and I spend a lot of coin on it. I can understand there why your flood insurance might cost less. But I have to assume that no matter what you do, because of the reality of the extreme weather conditions that we're now being confronted with, the global warming we're being confronted with, that whether a private insurer or even we, the taxpayers who have to underwrite this, you're never going to be able to get flood insurance at a reduced rate, even if you put your house in orbit near the shore. It's always going to go up now.
Well, the concept is that you might pay $31,000 or $35,000 a year for insurance if you don't elevate, and 1/10 of that, or $3,500 a year, if you do elevate. Obviously, the concept necessarily suggests that if you raise your property up to a certain level, that insurance companies are going to enter the market space and they're going to write insurance. If they don't, then you're still faced with a national flood insurance policy issue. Now, if the national flood insurance policy or FEMA is going to say, hey, I'm going to guarantee you that those rates are going to be lower, well, that's great. But the concept behind this is to encourage insurance companies to enter the space. And actually, I predict that some will if you have a sort of very, very high level house. Let's say you raise it 10 feet. Because from a flood perspective, that's going to be beneficial. Remember that this does not cover wind events. If your wind blows over your house, you might have a different situation because you won't be covered by flood insurance. Generally speaking, you'll be covered by the wind event that caused that problem.
All right, and Scott, finally, just in your assessment of looking at all the shore damage, of talking about insurance and opportunities to rebuild or to reoccupy space that you had to abandon, what is the advice that you would give, just personally, put aside the fact of to insure, not to insure, that is the question. Should the people return, and under what circumstances?
I think you have to ask yourself how much your property value is, and you have to ask yourself what the cost is to do it. If it's going to cost you $30,000 or $40,000 to elevate your property and you're doing it on your own, then you have to balance that, against what your insurance rates will be if you are going to have insurance. The reality is that it would really be a case-by-case circumstance. If it was me, I would have to look at the value of my property and the cost to elevate and what the benefit would be in terms of the actual lowering of that property. But if you're planning on staying there, if I was definitely planning on staying there, I'd elevate, and I'd elevate extraordinarily high. I'd pay the extra money. I'd elevate to 8, 10, or 12 feet so that I would be way above the value, the floodplain rules.
And a lot of the monies that will be appropriated through the $60 billion requested by the president are for beach nourishment, simply to have derricks and dredges go far offshore, suck the sand off the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, bring it back, basically vacuum it on shore, just to watch it get rushed out to sea again. Isn't that like a complete waste of money?
Well, whenever you dredge and you put sand out there, it is going to provide a temporary fix. You're absolutely right that ultimately it'll be re-eroded, but that's the nature of the beast. He's talking about, Governor Cuomo, using some of this money to actually purchase properties, so you don't know how much of that money is really going to be used for just that. There's also going to be money used to subsidize, additional foundation and other related programs that are designed to hopefully help the consumers. As you know and you've seen and you and I have spoken about, this money is coming very slow and it's very stressful, and it's just hysterical what is going on here in terms of terribly hysterical. It's awful that the money is not getting flowed out sooner to these residents, that insurance companies aren't paying either. It's just really terrible.
Do appreciate that update. Scott Major, National Disaster Specialist, nationally renowned attorney, sort of setting the playing field based on what we're being told by our local elected officials, what we're being told by Washington, what you're being told by the private sector that's providing insurance, because it is all extraordinarily confusing. One thing not confusing is the major sports headlines.